Hello, it's the Culture Genie, and as you might have heard on the news, Mikhail Gorbachev recently died, and it is in regards to his life that I am going to do this episode of Dark Side History. Mikhail Gorbachev, for those not in the know, was a Russian and Soviet politician who served as the last leader of the Soviet Union, as the country's head of state from 1988 to 1991, and through a long and complex series of events, with a conflict in Georgia, the Afghan war that had been dragging on for years, the Chernobyl accident in Ukraine and the fallout from that, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the gaining of independence of several Soviet republics as independent countries, led to Gorbachev dissolving the Soviet Union in December the 26th of 1991. However, the focus of this video is not going to be on what happened and what led to the fall of the Soviet Union during the reign of Gorbachev. Rather, the focus of this video is upon the view of Mikhail Gorbachev and how he was viewed generally. Here I am going to go for the Russian view of him, the view of him in the former Eastern Bloc outside of Russia, and the view of him among people in the West during the time. This video is going to deal with rough generalizations, so this will not apply to everyone, but it will give a good approximate view of how people viewed Gorbachev at the time directly after the fall of the Soviet Union. Firstly, let's start with the Russian view that was mostly negative with regards to Gorbachev, but even here there were some exceptions. For a lot of Russians, Gorbachev was seen as the destroyer of the imperial power of the Soviet Union, which was seen as just the continuation of Russia, by letting each of the Eastern European countries gain independence, thus reducing the size of the Russian Empire and its influence, which was felt as being painful to the pride of Russia. Worse still, those countries that gained independence due to the fall of the Soviet Union later joined the European Union and NATO, and are thus seen as the enemy today by those Russians that view NATO as being a threat. For all the things that Gorbachev did to reform the Soviet Union into a more free society, Gorbachev did not clean up the corruption, did not create a new, vibrant economy, replacing the old Soviet economy, and did not rebuild new institutions that would replace the old mess of the Soviet bureaucracy, leaving his work and reforms unfinished in a chaotic state as the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully. Gorbachev also left his legacy to Boris Yeltsin, who replaced him, who was an alcoholic and highly corrupt politician who mismanaged Russia's economy after the reform into the modern state of the Russian Federation of today. Gorbachev and later Boris are seen as having ruined the Russian economy, created divisiveness, and this
economic chaos
is also seen by certain people as having given Putin his opportunity to step in and straighten out the mess that was present at the end of the 90s. And also by letting a lot of states get independence and also letting certain areas of Russia break off and form their own countries, such as Ukraine, Russia became through this exposed to a lot of threats and lost a lot of important buffer states that were gone and areas that were strategically important, such as the Crimean Peninsula. This made a lot of Russians feel insecure from Western aggression. A bit of context for this. Russia has had a long history of getting invaded from the West. By Polish armies, by Swedish armies, by French armies, and by German armies. Thus, there does exist some historical reasons for why the Russians felt unsafe despite having nuclear weapons. Speaking about unsafe Russians, the fall of the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Eastern Bloc left a Russian diaspora in the eastern parts of Europe that now would be exposed to various types of repression and persecutions following the fall of the Soviet Union. Actually, there did happen a lot of rather unsavory things towards certain Russian minorities, so this isn't only Russian propaganda, and I might make a video about it in the future. However, despite all of these things that made Russians view Gorbachev negatively, it is important to mention that though even in Russia there existed those that saw him as a positive influence, taking Russia towards democracy and a more liberal and free society, away from the repression that categorized the Soviet Union. That was the view of him in Russia. But let's go to the West. On the other hand, many in the West saw Gorbachev quite differently from the Russians, much more positively. Many in the West saw Gorbachev as the enlightened one that saw to introduce freedom to the Soviet Union by introducing glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which is reconstruction, economic reform, into the Soviet system, and thus improving things. He was also seen as the man who allowed the Berlin Wall to be torn down and thus opened the East to the West in a way that it had not been before. And since Gorbachev allowed the Eastern European countries to become free from the Eastern Bloc without violence, mostly, it should be said, he was seen as the liberator of the oppressed peoples of Eastern Europe, as his actions led to the freedom of the countries in the Soviet Union, and thus as the ender of Russian imperialism in Eastern Europe, and as the man who ended the Cold War by dissolving the Eastern Bloc. On the subject of the Eastern Bloc, for the people in the former Eastern Bloc countries, of the countries that had been subservient to the Soviet Union, or even been a part of the Soviet Union, like Ukraine for example, views of Gorbachev were actually pretty mixed. First, it should be mentioned that Gorbachev actually wanted the Soviet and the Eastern Bloc system to continue. His reforms were not there to dissolve the Soviet Union, but rather to improve its economy and also stabilize it, which was the opposite of actually dissolving it. And a lot of Eastern Europeans know this, and thus don't view him as the kind of savior and liberator of them, as people in the West did due to this, since it was never his intention to liberate them. And Gorbachev, in certain Eastern countries, did actually violently suppress protests, for example in the Baltic countries and in Georgia. But he also did reforms that led to a better and freer life, so some people actually view him favorably due to him giving some more freedoms than before, whereas some view him negatively due to his repression. But again, there are some people that acknowledge that Gorbachev actually dissolved the Soviet Union and thus did give people a sort of liberation from Russian oppression, even though it was never intended as such from the beginning. However, on the subject of the fall of the Eastern Bloc and thus the fall of communism, it should be mentioned that some people actually saw the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and the communistic ideal that they represented as something good, and thus they would have viewed Gorbachev's dissolving of the Soviet Union as something very bad. And it should also be mentioned that the dissolving of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union led to a crash of the economies in the various former Eastern countries, at least initially, as there had been a lot of integration and mutual exchange of goods done within the Eastern countries, and this integration was now gone, and so were their jobs as well. And a lot of people suffered due to this. To add further suffering to people with regards to this, the protection systems such as pensions, healthcare and education were also gone temporarily for a lot of people, or lost forever for certain people. So we get some lost generations that would lose most of their future such as older people that had lost their pensions and the absolutely youngest who were most affected by having lost the school systems, at least temporarily. And now we can also go back to those Russian minorities that had lived well before due to the Soviet regime favoring them in the eastern countries. Well, let's just say that they were not that happy to lose all power and of being a helpless minority in these new countries, that in certain cases also faced discrimination and oppression afterwards. So bad that in certain cases a lot of Russians had to flee to Russia, losing their homes that they had lived in their entire life sometimes. These people would not have the most favorable view of Gorbachev, to put it lightly. As we can see in the former subservient Eastern Bloc states and in the countries that became independent from the Soviet Union, the views of Gorbachev are actually rather mixed. I wanted to discuss these views of Gorbachev because it's important to know that there existed very different views of the man, and this shows how persons in history can be viewed differently, and that you have to be aware of other viewpoints when discussing history and certain events or persons. Though on that subject of views, what are your views about Mikhail Gorbachev? Please give your comments in the comment section. And also don't forget to push the like button, as it helps this channel grow. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. Stärk väl kanalen min paddekom.